Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some interference dragon cards. When shopping at my local scrapbook store this week, I discovered this pink ink design Snapdragon stamp set and fell in love. Totally didn't go for that, but I have a soft spot for anything dragons. Really a lot of different mythical creatures. Dragons, mermaids, unicorns. I absolutely fell in love with this set and just needed to take it home and create with it. It has some fun and unique sentiments in there. The one that I decided to use for these cards says, "Women love mythical creatures, dragons, vampires, and men who listen." I thought that was hilarious. There's also one that says, "This girl is on fire." And then the third one says, "If you can't stand the heat, don't tickle the dragon." So I couldn't decide which color of interference ink I wanted to create these with. So I decided to use 3 different ones. So I have some distressed watercolor cardstock here. I love the distressed watercolor cardstock because it's nice and bright white. I have it trimmed down to 4.5 by 6.5. This dragon stamp is really quite large and it wouldn't fit all the way on an A2 card. So I decided to do all 5 by 7 cards here. So I'm going to do 3 different ones on white watercolor cardstock and then one on black watercolor cardstock. So the first one here, I have it stamped twice with some VersaMark ink, and I'm using some gold embossing powder. I did use some embossing powder tulle on there. But if you happen to have any of your embossing powder sticking anywhere it shouldn't, just use a soft brush to brush it off. And I do that with a couple of the embossings that I'm doing here. Once I have my embossing powder all over that VersaMark ink, I'm going to use my embossing tool to melt that powder. And if you haven't done embossing before, you can tell it's melted because it goes from dull granular to nice, smooth, glossy gold in this case. So I emboss that entire thing, and then I'm going to repeat that process. I'm going to do all of my embossing at once and then do all of my painting at once while I have my paint supplies out, and in this case, while I have my embossing supplies out. So I'm going to leave my positioning exactly the same for all of the cards to make it nice and easy. The only reason I'm doing multiple cards is because I couldn't decide which interference color I was really going to want to see with the dragon. So by doing all of them, I can see that you can see exactly how they're all going to look, and my curiosity will be filled. So for this second one here, I'm going to do different colors of embossing for the different ones. So this second one here, I'm using some walnut stain distress glaze. So basically it's a brown embossing powder. If I were to emboss over top of a patterned background, this embossing powder is clear, so you would see that pattern underneath it. But because I'm just embossing an outline, really it just looks like a brown embossing. And here's one where I got some embossing powder where I didn't really want it to go. So I'm just using a soft brush to lightly brush it off, and then I'll just blow on it to blow that powder away. And I do that over a scrap piece of paper so that I can catch those little bits of embossing powder. I'll put them back in my container if I have enough of them. Sometimes it's only a few granules or whatnot, so I don't even bother. So with this covered with that embossing powder, I can melt that, and it's going to melt exactly the same way as the gold. Only difference here is we're going to have a nice glossy brown. And I chose my embossing powder colors depending on the interference color I was wanting to use for the dragon. You could easily do all of them the exact same color if you wanted. And I'm using interference pads for my watercolor here. You could easily use some metallic watercolor or watercolors. I think they would look fantastic. You could use distressings. You could use whatever you want for your embossing. I just love the look, especially when it comes to dragons, to see that little interference, that little bit of colored shine on them. I think it looks really, really cool. So for my third one here, this one I'm going to emboss with silver embossing powder. But with all of my backgrounds here, I am stamping it twice just to make sure that I have a nice, clean, crisp stamping. For most of them, just that one stamping was enough. I could tilt into the light and see where that ink was and know that it was completely covered. But I always like to do it a second time just at the off chance that I have missed something. So here's another one that you can see. I got a little bit of an area on the back of the dragon that is messy. So I'm going to use that brush to clean it up. Sometimes I think I just have ink on my hands and I touch something before stamping, and that's generally probably what happens, but it's really easy to clean up. If it was something that I couldn't clean up, I would grab another piece of watercolor cardstock, or I would just brush all the embossing powder off of this, flip it over and use the other side. However, often with watercolor cardstock, you have one side that is smooth or smooth-ish and one side that has some texture to it. And I tend to prefer to do my watercoloring, especially with stamped images, on the smooth side, mainly because it's easier to get a crisp stamping when you're working on smoother cardstock. And by using a textured side, it's harder to have a nice, clean, crisp stamping on there. So I tend to use the smoothest side possible. So for my fourth one here, I'm going to use that black watercolor paper, making sure to use that embossing powder tool. This one, I am going to emboss it with that silver embossing powder, same as the last one that I did, because I'm going to use the same color on this dragon that I use on the one on white watercolor paper. And it's going to make a little bit more sense in a little bit. So I'm going to stamp it twice. I do use a stamp pressure tool to make sure that I have even pressure all the way around while I'm doing my stamping. And then I'm going to pour that silver embossing powder off, take any excess off of there, tap any excess off of there, and all of this that goes onto my scrap piece of paper gets poured right back into that jar, so there's no waste. And I love that about embossing, is you can collect anything that doesn't stick to your stamped image. It goes right back into the jar, and a jar of embossing powder lasts a really, really long time. Then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that, and you can really see the change between the dull granular look and the shiny glossy look when we do it on black watercolor paper or black cardstock. Even you would see that change a lot easier. I love the vibrancy of that, and you could even leave this like this if you wanted and not watercolor it, but it's going to look really cool when it's watercolored. Now, when I'm using interference inks, the thing with interference inks is they have two colors to them. One is a dye-based color that shows up on light or white cardstock, and one is a more pigmented interference mica color that shows up on dark. So in order to play with that, when I'm working with white cardstock, I'll often use white distress ink and color some area with that, black distress ink and color some area with that black distress ink to make those two different colors to show off those properties of that interference. But for this, I decided on my black cardstock, I'm going to take my white distress watercolor pencil and I'm going to do some shading in different areas with that white. So I'm doing it on the tip of the wings, and then I'm doing it on the head and the belly area of the dragon, as well as the little triangle piece for his tail. I'm going to do the same thing on my white watercolor paper, but I'm going to use the black distress watercolor pencil. And I chose the distress watercolor pencil because it's got some pigment in it that makes it a little bit more opaque. For doing it on the black, you could use a white pigment pad, but I've never tried watercoloring with that. I chose this simply because in one package I have the medium to do the different coloring on both my black watercolor cardstock as well as my white. So here is what it looks like here on the black watercolor. I'm going to do one of the ones with the black watercolor pencil on white watercolor paper, and then I'll do the other two off screen because it's going to be exactly the same. So I'm going to put this black at the exact same areas that I did the white on the black watercolor cardstock. I'm going to do it on the wing tips, and then I'm going to do it on the belly. Now I just grabbed that distress water or the distress pad just to say that if you wanted, you could do this same step with the distress pad. The only thing with the distress pad is a little bit more transparent because it's only dye based. The watercolor pencils have some pigment properties to them, so it's a little bit more opaque. I'm also making sure that all of my watercoloring here is completely dry before I go in with that interference pad. Now, when I go in with that interference color, it is going to rehydrate this color, this black or the white on the black watercolor. I'm saying white and black a whole lot, which starts to get a little bit confusing. But when I go over, it is going to rehydrate that ink, but it's going to do it very quickly, and I'm going to do my watercoloring very quickly so that I'm not lingering and I'm not spreading that ink around too much, so that that ink stays pretty much where it is. So that is how I'm going to do the black one on the white, and I'm doing the other two off screen. So for my first watercoloring, or for my first interference pad, I'm going to use the charcoal gold. Now, I often love using my interference pads to go around my mats to color them. And when I do that, I often get a whole lot of excess ink on my glass mat that I have to wipe up and waste. Knowing that I do that, I decided rather than waste it, I was going to do my inking around that cardstock and then use up that waste and use that to do my watercoloring. So for all of my dragons, I'm going to start where I've done the previous watercoloring on my white watercolor cardstock where I have the black watercolor pencil. I'm going to start in those areas and then spread out from there. And then I will fill in different areas. So I'll do the wings first, then I start with the head of the dragon and just kind of work my way down the dragon. When it comes to painting on the areas that I already have that black, I'm going to do it very, very quickly. The other thing that I am going to do is after I have different areas watercolored, I will often go pick up a little bit more color on my brush and then just deepen and darken some areas. I want some areas to have some shadow to them. I want some areas to be a little bit darker. Just, you want to do it however you want the finished look to be. Best to do this while it is still wet. That way you're not going to get any watermarks to it. Now, if you haven't seen me do watercolor before, I have a watercolor brush here. It's made by Zig, and it has the water right in the handle. So when I want to change colors, all I have to do is squeeze this brush over top of some paper towel and it will flush water right through that brush and it will clean it off and it'll be clean for my next watercoloring. So this is it when it's really wet still, when it's just being watercolored. As it dries, that dye is going to sink into that watercolor or into the paper and you're going to see more of that interference on there. So after a few moments, you saw the second time where I was tilting it, it did dry. So when I tilt it into the light, you see a little bit more of that gold interference. For my second color, I'm using Royal Truffle. So this is going to show up brown on white or light, and then on the black or dark cardstock, or in this case on the black watercolor pencil, we're going to have some blue interference. So once this is done, when you tilt it into the light, you're going to see that blue interference. And even on the white or the lighter areas where you see lighter color, some of those areas, especially where that color is a little bit heavier, you will still see some of that interference. And it happens when you tilt it into the light. It really, in my opinion, is kind of a magical look. I have a soft spot anyways for anything that's opalescent interference. So these are right up my alley. And I've been playing with them for, I think, about 1.5 years now, and I never get tired of creating with them. Now I'm using the full pad here on my glass surface to do this watercolor. You could also, if you have the refills, the ink refills, you could use those instead. You could do a palette with them and have them in there and do that watercoloring with those ink refills as well. Because of how I'm inking my mats and I have this excess ink here that is going to waste, it's best to just use this up rather than using extra or using some re-inker. So you can see how quickly I'm coloring these. I'm not spending a ton of time on coloring them. I'm concentrating where that black watercolor pencil is. That's where I want my color to be the darkest. That's where I'm starting. And anytime I go back in, I'm just making some areas a little bit darker. For my last 2 cards here, I'm going to use the Regal Gray. So this one is going to show up gray on white or light cardstock, and it's going to have some purple interference to it. So I did both mats. I can set those aside to dry while I'm doing my watercoloring. I'm starting with my white watercolor paper dragon. And once again, I'm going into that excess ink there, watercoloring where I've done that black watercolor pencil first. You can see how I have my hand lifted up a little bit. I'm not dragging it on my table, and that's mainly so I don't get ink on my hand. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if there's ink somewhere or wet glossy accents or stickle somewhere, that tends to be where my hand goes first. So I'm trying to concentrate on keeping my hand lifted up so that I don't accidentally get some ink on it and then accidentally smudge it all over my piece here. So you can see also that as I'm moving my paper around, I have my brush pointed to where I want my color to be the darkest, and my hand positioning doesn't change a whole lot when I'm doing my watercoloring. However, I'm constantly moving that paper. So I'm paying attention to where I want the color to be the darkest, and I am moving my paper so that my brush is pointed to where it's the darkest. The only time that changes is once everything is wet or damp and I go back in and darken some areas. I don't really change the angle or the positioning of my paper there. I'll just paint those areas in. And because that's already damp, that paint is going to start blending and bleeding with the already wet areas. So here we have the one done on the black watercolor cardstock. And once again, I'm starting where I have that white watercolor pencil colored down on there. You're not going to see a whole lot until this is dry. It looks like I'm lightening up that white area, and I'm probably lightening it up just a tiny little bit, but once it's dry, you'll see more of that. Right now, when it's wet, it tends to make that color look a little bit paler, but you'll see a lot more of that white color once that has completely dried. And I'm doing the same method through all of my dragons, starting at the wings and then going from the head and then working my way to the tail. And anytime I start my color where I want it to be darkest, I'll move that paper so that that's where my brush is pointed. And then as I'm blending that color out, painting that color out, there's going to be less color on that brush, so there's going to be less color going onto that paper. Now, because this is a gray interference or a gray dye that has purple interference to it, this dragon here is going to look more purple, or we're going to see a little bit more of that gray over top of the white, whereas on the white watercolor cardstock, we're going to see more of that gray and then purple where it's on that black. So it creates a really cool look depending on the background that you're working on. And once again, you're going to see a lot more of that color once that paint has had some time to settle down and dry. Now I want to do a little bit of ink blending on the backgrounds of my cards so that it looks like it's a dragon in the sky, but because I don't have any ink that will be blended easily onto black cardstock without interfering with the color of the dragon, I'm taking the interference colors that I've used for the other dragons and using that on this for the sky. So this is the Royal Truffle, but this is the one that shows up blue on black cardstock. So I'm only going in and starting right around the edges of the dragon and then just blending out. I only want a hint of color. I don't want to take any focus away from this dragon. So I want to have that blue on there as a suggestion of a sky. I'm not necessarily wanting the entire background to be colored blue. If I wanted the entire background to be colored blue, I likely would have started with some blue cardstock. I want to see just a little bit of the blue in the sky so you get that idea. And in this case, in my mind, it's more of a night sky because we've got that dark cardstock there. And again, because it's wet, you don't really see that color until it dries. So you're not really seeing a whole lot happening while I'm painting it. In real life, you can see it a little bit more, but it shows up a lot more once it has dried. Then I'm going to use that charcoal gold one, and that one's going to show up gold on the black cardstock. And I'm going to use that to color in the little flowers. So there's some little flowers all around him. So I'm going to use that gold to just give those flowers a little bit of a different color. I didn't want to add in too many other colors to this. I wanted to make sure that the focus stayed on the dragons there. So by using those same colors, I'm adding just a little bit of that color to those areas, but I'm not doing any colors that are going to take away focus. It's just going to add just a little bit of detail. You could also leave those flowers as is and leave them without color on them. But I think it's a nice detail to have in there, and to add a little bit of extra color is kind of nice. So again, this is the charcoal gold, and I'm just going in and adding that gold to the flowers. I'm putting it in some of the stars that have open areas as well. Once that's done, I can clean that off of my desk. And I'm going to take some glossy accents. I have it with it in a bottle that has a really fine tip to it. And I'm going to add some glossy accents dots to the dots or the spots on the back of the dragon's tail. It's going to give it some extra texture. It's going to give it a little bit of extra gloss. And I just love the way that it looks. So any area that has some of these circles drawn to give that visual texture, I'm just going to add that glossy accents in little dots of different varying sizes all the way down the back. There's a few on his arms and legs as well. I'll add those there. Basically putting them inside the areas that are embossed with those details on there. And then I'm going to set those to the side. I'm going to do that to all 4 of the dragons. It goes really, really quick. And then you do want to set that aside and let that dry completely before doing anything else. Another option would be to save this detail to your cards were already put together. But the day that I was working on this, I had to do something for probably about an hour. So this was the perfect time to do it. I could put that Glossy Accents dots on there and let them completely dry before wanting to work or needing to work on the next step for these cards. So you can see how quickly adding those Glossy Accents details to it is, but it adds just some really great texture as well as some glossy shine. And if you compare all of the dragon cards together, dots are all likely in different spots. So I don't think it really matters. Precision doesn't really matter when it comes to it. It's more about that texture to it. It just adds another layer of interest, in my opinion. So once this is completely done, I will let that dry completely before moving on to my next step. Some of the dots are going to dry a little bit quicker than others, and I waited about an hour, so that was probably more time than I really needed to. It probably would have dried a little bit quicker than this. If you want to have something to test to make sure that it's dry, what I would suggest is having a scrap piece of paper and putting some dots on that are similar sizes, and then you can touch that scrap piece of paper just to see if your Glossy Accents is dry. For the background, just like the black one, I want on the white ones to have just a hint of the sky. I don't want the background to be completely blue. So I'm taking some Stormy Sky Distress ink and a large Spellbinders ink blending brush, and I'm just lightly blending just right behind that dragon and then blending it out a little bit. It adds that blue to the sky, but you still see white towards most of the edges of the cards, and it just makes it come alive, in my opinion. It adds a really nice detail to it, and because the colors that I use to paint the dragon are darker than that blue, I don't have to really worry about that blue interacting or changing the color that I use to paint the dragons. It's light, and I'm doing light ink blending here, so I'm not really worried about changing the color that I used to do my watercoloring. Another option here would be to use some blue ink and do watercolor for the sky. This was a lot quicker and, in my opinion, a lot more subtle. So with those done, I can start to assemble my cards. So I have my card bases done. These are 5x7 card bases. My mats are cut to 4 3/4 by 6 3/4. And the pieces, like I said before, that I have the dragons stamped and embossed on, those are 4.5 by 6.5 inches. So when I did my inking around the edges of the mats, I only did the outside edges, and that's because that's all you're going to see. There's no point in wasting ink and having a bunch of ink behind an area that's completely covered. So for the next one here, once again, I have a 5x7 card. I'm going to glue down my mats. These all get glued down exactly the same way. There's nothing different about each one of them. The only thing different is the colors that I used to color the mat behind there. And I like to use those ink or the interference inks to do that coloring, mainly because they're such unique inks that I think it would be fairly difficult to find cardstock colors that would match perfectly. And by using the exact inks that were used to watercolor, it blends beautifully. It has a little bit of that interference color, so you still see that. And in my opinion, it really highlights your image and it makes it look really interesting and unique. And I just use Barely Art glue for gluing everything together. It's a nice liquid glue. I have it in a fine tip bottle, so it works well for small, fine die cuts, as well as gluing larger pieces of cardstock here. So you can see how easy these come together. I also have a nice large acrylic block that I use to just put it on the different layers as I'm letting them dry. It just holds everything down nice and flat, makes sure that nothing buckles or nothing bends, and frees up my hands to work on the next step. So once I have all of my cards put together here, I want to add a few extra details. Now I'm taking some Stardust stickles and I'm just adding dots in the center of the flowers on the one that has the black background. And then I decided, even though I'd already done the glossy accents, I thought it would be great to have a dot of glossy accents where the eye was. So I just added that and then set that aside to dry. For the rest of the dragons here, I'm using some Tombow markers. So I'm using number 991, which is the light yellow color, number 620, which is the lavender color, and then 229, which is a sage green. And I'm coloring the different flowers depending on the colors that I'm using here. So here I'm using the light yellow color. On my Regal Gray one, I'm going to use the lavender color. These I specifically chose very pale colors so that it wasn't going to interfere or take any attention away from that dragon. So I just colored them lightly, added that glossy accents dot to the dragon's eye, as well as the stickles in the center of the flowers. That stickles is just going to add a tiny little bit of sparkle when you tilt it in the light. It's not going to add any color to it. I don't typically use stickles that add a lot of color for the most part, especially for things like this. I'm mainly looking for the shimmer and just a tiny little bit of texture. So this one here is the one that I use, that light lavender color. And again, it just ties in and coordinates with the interference color of this ink. It's not taking anything away from that dragon. It's still the focal point, but it coordinates beautifully. And like I said before, you could leave these alone and not do any coloring to them for the flowers. You could leave them just the embossed outline. But I really think adding that just touch of color blends in beautifully. For this last one here, this is the one that is the charcoal gold color. So I'm going to bring in that yellow again and color the flowers that yellow color. For this one though, I'm going to add a little bit of a Stardust gel pen and color that over top just to give it a little bit of a shimmer. You don't see a whole lot of the shimmer, it just is a little bit of a different background. And then for the center of these flowers, I'm going to add some pale gold Nouveau drops just to give the centers of them a little bit of a different look than the other cards. Again, you could use some stickles instead. That would be beautiful. I just wanted to do something just a tiny little bit different for this one. So for the coloring of the petals, I'm just doing a little bit of coloring in them. This Stardust pen doesn't have a ton of color to it. It has a little bit of a gold shimmer to it. So it's going to blend in beautifully with that that yellow Tombow marker that I used to color it. And I'm using Tombow markers. They're a nice dye-based marker. You can use whatever your favorite marker is for coloring. Again, it's just to add just a touch of color. You could use watercolors as well and watercolor them. I figured that the dye-based markers were going to be the quickest and easiest though. So here are all the finished cards. I'd love it if you put in the comments which one is your favorite. I have my favorite. It's not this one. This one is the one done with that charcoal gold. This one is the one on the white background with the Regal Gray, and spoiler, this one is my favorite. And then we have the one done with the Royal Truffle. Oh, this is the other Regal Gray one. So this is the Regal Gray on black, and then finally the Royal Truffle. So you can see how different those two dragons look, even though they're both done with the Regal Gray, depending on the background and which of the watercolor pencils we used. And then, like I said, lastly, we have that Royal Truffle one. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed watching me to create these interference dragon cards as much as I enjoyed creating them. I absolutely love the final result of them and can't wait to play with this stamp set again. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. Have a fantastic day.